The pickaxe struck once. Plaster exploded like shattered bone. From the black mouth that opened in the wall, a human skull rolled out, bleached white, jaw still locked in a silent scream. Its empty socket stared straight into the living man's soul, as if to say, "You have awakened what heaven itself sealed." The air in the old house did not merely smell of decay. It tasted of it, thick, metallic, like blood left too long in the earth. A silence so complete it pressed against the eardrums, the kind of silence that follows a scream no one ever heard. For 22 years that wall had stood, innocent as any other stretch of plaster and brick in the ruined Voclair Plantation. Then the steel bit deep. Crack! Dust rained down like gray snow. A small, round thing slipped from the darkness, bounced once, and came to rest at the man's boots. A skull. Not an animal's. Human. The bone so clean it almost glowed in the slanted afternoon light. Its eye sockets were two black wells that seemed to follow the intruder no matter where he stepped. The teeth, still perfect, were clenched as though the final word had been bitten back forever. Before we descend any deeper into the cursed heart of Voclair, understand this: what fell out of that wall was not merely evidence. It was an accusation. A cry that had waited for divine justice the way Abel's blood waited beneath the ground. And once that cry was loosed, nothing in Iberville Parish would ever be the same again. It was late September 1887 when Arthur Devo first felt the plantation's gaze upon him. The packet boat Belle of Natchez churned down the Mississippi like a guilty conscience trying to outrun its own shadow. Paddle wheels slapped the brown water in slow, rhythmic penance. Arthur stood at the rail, 41 years old, face carved by years of measuring other men's ruins. The war had taken his father's mercantile empire in New Orleans. What remained was a son who trusted nothing that could not be weighed, counted, or written into a ledger. He had come to Iberville Parish on the coldest of errands, to carve up the corpse of Voclair Plantation for lawyers who cared only for dollars. The estate had stood empty since 1865, 22 years of rotten silence. Yet as the boat slid past, the cypress knees rising from the water like fingers of the drowned, Arthur felt something he could not ledger. A prickle at the base of his neck. The sense that the land itself was watching, waiting for the right man to open the wrong door. The air was wet wool against his skin. Sugarcane fields shimmered in the distance like green fire. Spanish moss hung from live oaks and lawn, funereal veils, swaying though there was no wind. Every breath carried the sweet-wrought perfume of the bayou jasmine, mud, and something older, something that had never been named. A rickety carriage met him at the Plaquemine landing. The driver, a sun-blackened man who spoke only in grunts, flicked the reins and said nothing more. The road wound inland through tunnels of cypress. Alligators slid into hidden water with wet sighs. Insects sang a single, endless note of warning. Arthur's city heart beat faster than it should have. He told himself it was only the heat. Deep down he knew better. When the trees finally parted, Voclair rose like a ghost that had forgotten how to lie down and die. Greek revival columns, once proud as temple pillars, now lean like broken teeth. Paint the color of old bone peeled in long strips, revealing dark heartwood beneath. Vines had invaded the wide verandas, their tendrils thick as wrists, squeezing railings until wood groaned. The gardens were no longer gardens, they were a riot of resurrection oleander, night-blooming cereus, and wild roses that had forgotten kindness. Statues of forgotten gods lay toppled, half swallowed by green. Arthur stepped down. The ground itself seemed to yield under his boots, soft as fresh-turned grave soil. The silence here was different from the forest. It was expectant. I held breath. As though the house had been waiting specifically for him. Thomas Greer was already there, 38, lean as whipcord, eyes the pale blue of winter sky over a battlefield. He carried a pickaxe the way other men carry prayer books. When he spoke, his voice was low gravel. Mr. Devo. Nothing more. Yet in that single word Arthur heard the quiet competence of a man who had already decided the house was not to be trusted. 2 days later young Edgar Tate arrived, 24, spectacles perpetually fogged, leather journal already half filled with sketches. His enthusiasm was almost violent in its brightness. He bounded up the crumbling steps like a boy entering a cathedral, unaware that cathedrals sometimes hide crypts. Together the three men began the slow autopsy of Voclair. Inside, every room was a stopped clock. Dust motes swirled in blades of light like souls refusing to leave. Floorboards sang out underfoot sharp, pain notes as though the wood remembered every foot that had ever trod it. In the grand parlor a grand piano stood, keys warped into yellow smiles. Moth-eaten velvet drapes hung in tatters, framing windows that looked out on wilderness that had once been lawns. At night the cypress forest pressed against the walls like a congregation at a funeral. Frogs, crickets, the occasional scream of a night heron, sounds that belonged to the wild, not to any house built by men. Arthur slept little. When he did, dreams came. In them the walls breathed. They expanded and contracted like lungs filled with guilt. Sometimes he heard a child's voice whispering a single word he could never quite catch. One dusk he paused before the massive oil portrait in the front parlor. Henri Voclair, painted around 1858, stared down with the cold certainty of a man who had never once doubted his right to own other souls. Heavy jowls, black eyes like polished obsidian. The artist had captured something the living man probably never saw in a mirror, the look of a soul already damned and proud of it. Arthur felt those painted eyes track him across the room. He told himself it was only the angle of the light. The house told him otherwise. Day after day they catalogued. Broken settees. Silver candlesticks black with tarnish. A rack of hunting rifles whose barrels had rusted into the shape of question marks. Arthur dictated, Edgar wrote. Every object felt heavier than it should. Each one carried the faint perfume of lives abruptly erased. Then, in the study, they found the ledgers. Leather cracked like old skin. Pages brittle as communion wafers. Arthur opened one. Columns marched down the paper in Henri Voclair's severe hand. Tusan, stonemason, $1,800. Adele, house servant/healer, $1,200. Felix, boy, age 15, $900. No last names. Just inventory. Human beings priced like mules. Arthur read the names aloud, voice cracking on the third one. The sound of his own voice in that room felt obscene. Edgar looked up from his sketch, face pale. These aren't numbers, Mr. Devo, Arthur whispered. They're souls. And someone weighed them. He closed the ledger as though shutting a Bible that had been used for evil. The moral weight settled on his shoulders like wet iron. This was no longer an assessment. It was a reckoning. Later that week they discovered the locked room off the back gallery, a heavy cypress door, iron lock rusted into permanence. No floor plan showed it. No key existed. Arthur made a note, but the question mark burned behind his eyes. It was Thomas Greer who first voiced the deeper strangeness. While clearing vines from the north wall he paused, pickaxe resting on his shoulder. Some of these walls ain't right, sir. He pointed to a long stretch of plaster. Should be open here. Doorway, maybe whole room. But it's bricked. And the brick, it's newer. Arthur dismissed it at first. Old houses change. But the word brick lodged in his mind like a splinter. Bricked. Sealed. Buried. The heat pressed down. Sugarcane whispered at the edges of the property like conspirators. One afternoon Edgar wandered to the property line and met Levi Dubose, an old man of 70, skin like weathered mahogany. Eyes still sharp enough to cut glass. Levi was cutting cane with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man who had measured his life in machete strokes. He would not set foot on Voclair land. Not for love nor money. They remember, he said, voice low as distant thunder. Tusan. Adele. Felix. 3 souls who built these walls, and then disappeared inside them. Levi's gaze drifted to the decaying mansion. April 1865. Last weeks before the Yankees came. One morning they were here. Next morning gone. Master Voclair told the quarters they ran north. But Tusan was the stonemason. He knew every brick, every mortar joint. He was the only man alive who could have sealed a room from the inside, or been sealed in it. The old man turned away. His machete flashed once more in the green light. That house don't forget. And neither does God. The words sank into Edgar like stones into still water. When he repeated them to Arthur that evening, the air in the parlor seemed to thicken. The portrait of Henri Voclair watched them both. 3 days later, Thomas Greer was clearing the narrow service corridor that ran behind the north wall, the hidden artery once used by enslaved feet so the white family would never have to see the people who kept their world alive. His pickaxe chipped mortar. Plaster fell away in sheets. And Greer stopped. The section directly in front of him, 12 feet wide, was wrong. The plaster was newer, smoother, a sickly gray that did not match the deep, organic brown of the original walls. Even the brick lines beneath showed a different pattern, a different hand. Greer's pale eyes narrowed. He pressed his palm to the surface. It was cold. Colder than the rest of the house. Colder than it had any right to be in the Louisiana heat. He turned toward the main hall where Arthur and Edgar worked and called out, voice steady but carrying a new weight. "Mr. Devo, you'd better come see this." The wall was about to speak. And what it had to say had been waiting since 1865 for a man brave or foolish enough to listen. The dull thud of the pickaxe head against plaster had already become a rhythm of judgment. Each strike sent gray clouds spiraling upward, catching the pale morning light in slow, mournful eddies. Thomas Greer swung with the economy of a man who had long ago learned that violence, whether against stone or flesh, demands precision, not passion. The wall resisted at first, as though it understood what lay behind it and preferred to keep it secret. But no wall built by human hands can forever defy the will of truth when truth finally arrives with steel. Plaster gave. Brick crumbled. Mortar dust drifted like incense offered to forgotten saints. And then the air changed. It came first as a sigh, low, almost human, slipping through the widening breach. Not the humid Louisiana breath of September, but something older, drier, colder. A breath that had been held since the final days of a war that changed everything except cruelty. It carried scents no living lung should ever meet again, the faint metallic tang of old blood long dried, the sour rot of trapped hair and skin, the sweet undertone of decay that clings to despair. Greer froze, pickaxe suspended. His pale eyes that had seen too many dawns over cotton fields, narrowed. He did not speak. He did not need to. Arthur stepped forward. Lantern light trembled in his grip. The opening was now wide enough for a man to pass through if he dared. He did not dare yet. Instead, he lifted the flame higher. A single bone-white object rolled from the darkness, bounced once on the warped floorboards, and came to rest against Greer's boot. A human hand. Not detached by violence. Not cleanly severed. The wrist bones still articulated, the phalanges curled inward as though clutching at the last thread of breath. The metacarpals were delicate, almost feminine. Fingernails, longer than they should have been, had grown in the dark until they curled like blackened claws. Time had preserved the final gesture, reaching, pleading, scratching at. Unyielding brick. Arthur's stomach lurched. He had prepared himself for bones. He had not prepared himself for intention. Greer lowered the pickaxe slowly, reverently. Edgar retreated 2 paces, one hand clamped over his mouth, the other clutching his journal like scripture. No one spoke. The house itself seemed to lean in, listening. Arthur forced his legs to move. He crouched. Lantern light played across the skeletal fingers. Faint parallel scratches marred the interior brick, dozens, hundreds, nails worn to nothing in futile prayer. Someone had tried. Someone had tried for a very long time. He rose. His voice, when it came, sounded foreign to his own ears, thin, cracked. "Thomas, more light." They worked in silence now, widening the breach with careful, almost liturgical strokes. Each fallen brick felt like the removal of a seal from a cursed scroll. When the opening was large enough, Arthur stepped through. The room was small. 12 feet by 8. No window. No vent. No door save the one they had just violated. A tomb constructed in haste and sealed in panic. The lantern swept across the floor. 3 sets of remains lay where gravity and despair had left them. One adult male, broad-shouldered even in death, curled in the far corner as though trying to shield something behind him. His spine was flexed, skull tilted toward the ceiling in a final, silent appeal. Ribs splayed open like broken wings. Beside him, a smaller adult frame, female by the delicate pelvic curve, lay on her side, knees drawn to chest, arms wrapped around what had once been a child. Her skull rested against the boy's, forehead to forehead, as though she had spent the last hours whispering psalms into his ear. The child, small, no more than 16, lay between them, fetal, hands pressed to ears as though he could block out the sound of his own suffocation. They had not been arranged. They had died exactly where terror had pinned them. Arthur felt the floor tilt beneath him. Not from dizziness. From dizziness. From the sheer moral weight of what he witnessed. These were not anonymous skeletons. These were Tusan, Adele, Felix. The names Levi Dubose had carried like stones in his pockets for 22 years. The names that had vanished from every ledger the moment the war's end came too late to save them. He forced himself to catalogue, to measure, to pretend professionalism could armor him against horror. A splintered wooden crate lay overturned near the center, perhaps once a storage box for tools or provisions. Now it was a broken altar. From its wreckage Arthur lifted a small tin box, wax-sealed, surface pitted with rust but still whole. A woman's tortoiseshell comb, teeth unbroken, carved with tiny flowers along the spine. A child's shoe, left foot, leather cracked like dry earth, sole worn thin from running errands, not from running away. A folded length of homespun cloth, edges frayed, bearing the faint raised outline of what might once have been embroidered scripture, "The Lord is my shepherd." He placed each item into his canvas satchel as though handling relics from Calvary itself. Every touch felt like sacrilege. Every touch felt necessary. He sent Edgar galloping to Plaquemine with a note for Dr. Austin Prevost, parish coroner. Human remains discovered, sealed chamber, Voclair Plantation. Urgent. Immediate examination required. A second letter went to Beaulieu and Associates in New Orleans. The usual crisp formality was gone. In its place, raw urgency. The assessment has become something else entirely. A crime demands witness. While they waited, the plantation changed. The decay no longer felt passive. It felt complicit. Floors creaked with new purpose. Shadows stretched longer. The portrait of Henri Voclair in the parlor seemed to follow Arthur with a colder satisfaction, as though the painted eyes knew the game was finally ending. One afternoon, standing before that canvas in slanting light, Arthur saw it, a thin diagonal scar across the painted face. Temple to cheekbone. Skillfully repaired, varnished over, invisible except when the sun struck at exactly the right angle. Someone long ago had taken a blade to the portrait. Not to destroy it. To wound it. To mark the man who could no longer bleed. A quiet act of vengeance. A scar that had waited 22 years to be noticed. 3 days later Dr. Prevost arrived, black suit immaculate, satchel heavy with instruments of detachment. He entered the sealed room without flourish. Lantern. Gloves. Notebook. He examined each skeleton with clinical reverence, dictating observations in a voice that never wavered. Later, his report, delivered in neat copperplate, read like a verdict. 3 individuals. Adult male, 40 to 50 years. Adult female, 30 to 40 years. Adolescent, 15 to 17 years. No evidence of perimortem trauma sufficient to cause death. Positioning of remains, flexion of limbs, proximity, and interior scratch marks on brick consistent with prolonged ante-mortem confinement in restricted space. Conclusion: occupants were sealed inside while still living. Asphyxiation and/or dehydration probable mechanism of death. He filed the report with the parish. No one opened an investigation. It was 1887. Reconstruction had collapsed into compromise. Black lives, especially dead ones, carried no legal gravity. The 3 in the wall were still, in the eyes of the law that had once owned them, property. And property cannot be murdered. Arthur felt the fury rise, cold, clean, unfamiliar. Not the hot rage of youth, but the slow-burning indignation of a man who had spent his life measuring things and now discovered that justice could not be measured at all. He refused to close the ledger. Without mandate, without permission, he began to search. Parish clerk's office gave him nothing but polite evasion, until one clerk, almost as an afterthought, mentioned old Remy. Fontenot's daughter, Nora. Schoolteacher. Keeper of her late father's notarial archive. Arthur found her in Plaquemines' modest clapboard schoolhouse. Not the stern matron he expected, but a woman in her late 30s, dark hair pinned neatly, eyes direct and unafraid. She listened to his halting explanation without flinching. When he spoke the names Tusan, Adele, Felix, something flickered behind her composure. Recognition. Sorrow. A daughter's memory of a father who had carried ugly truths home. My father kept everything, she said quietly. He believed paper never lies, even when men do. She led him to the back room. Leather trunks. Dust. The smell of old ink and forgotten promises. For 3 evenings they worked by lamplight after the children had gone. Page after page of deeds, bills of sale, marriage contracts, wills. Nora navigated her father's system with quiet genius, her fingers moving like a pianist remembering a requiem. On the third night, moon high, she paused. Here. March 1865. 6 weeks before the final Union advance reached Iberville. A notarized transfer document. Henri Voclair conveying ownership of 3 enslaved persons, Tusan, Adele, and the minor Felix, to the Dufresne Mercantile Trust in New Orleans. Arthur stared at the page. The names stared back. A legal erasure. A paper death. A transaction designed to make 3 human beings vanish from every record, just before they vanished from the world. The room was silent except for the soft hiss of the lamp. Nora closed the trunk gently. Whatever happened in that wall, she said, voice steady but low, began on paper long before it ended in brick. Arthur felt the final piece click into place, not with satisfaction, but with dread. Henri Voclair had not merely killed them. He had first made them disappear on paper, so that when they disappeared in truth, no one would ever come looking. But someone had come looking. And now the wall had answered. The judgment that had waited 22 years was no longer silent. It had a witness. And its name was Arthur Devo. The document lay between them on the scarred schoolhouse table like an open wound. March 1865. Henri Voclair's severe script transferred ownership of Tusan, Adele, and the minor Felix to the Dufresne Mercantile Trust of New Orleans. No acreage. No livestock. No machinery. Just 3 souls. Purchase price, $1. $1. Not a typo. Not an error in transcription. Bold, deliberate numerals scrawled in the margin as though the sum itself were a signature of contempt. Nora Fontenot's fingers hovered above the page. She read it again, slowly, as though hoping the ink might rearrange itself into mercy. When she looked up, her eyes held no tears. Only a quiet, burning comprehension. This wasn't commerce, she whispered. This was erasure. Arthur felt the room tilt. $1. The legal fiction that allowed 3 human beings to vanish from every record book before they vanished from the world. A paper prelude to murder. Voclair hadn't sold them for profit. He had sold them to himself through a shell entity so that when the Union came, no creditor could claim what he had already decided to destroy. The schoolhouse clock ticked once. Twice. Outside, children's laughter drifted like something from another life. Arthur folded the transfer carefully, as though gentleness could undo cruelty. He made them disappear on paper first, he said. So no one would ever come looking when they disappeared in truth. Nora nodded once. My father notarized hundreds like this. He never spoke of them. But he kept them. All of them. They sat in silence a long moment, 2 people separated by race, class, history, yet bound now by the same horror. Arthur left Plaquemine that afternoon with the document sealed in oilskin against his chest. The weight felt like iron. New Orleans in October 1887 smelled of sulfur and fear. Yellow fever rumors still ghosted the streets. Bonfires burned day and night, orange glows flickering against shuttered galleries. The riverfront, usually a riot of cotton bales and shouts, moved with the tense caution of people who remembered last summer's coffins stacked like cordwood. Arthur and Edgar moved through it like men carrying plague themselves. Their target, the Dufresne Mercantile Trust. The trail was cold, deliberately so. The trust had dissolved in 1866, conveniently 1 year after Appomattox and Voclair's disappearance. Its meager records had supposedly been absorbed by Chabrier and Sons, a marble-columned firm on Canal Street whose brass plaque gleamed like a denial. The clerk who received Arthur wore spotless linen and a smile polished to indifference. The Dufresne materials? Regrettably destroyed. The flood of 67. Water rose to the second floor. Irreplaceable, I'm afraid. Arthur studied the man's eyes. No sorrow. Only the calm certainty of someone reciting a rehearsed lie. He thanked the clerk. Left. The sulfur smoke clung to his coat like accusation. Next, Clarence Knoll, Voclair's old cotton factor. 74 now, living in faded Esplanade Avenue splendor with his daughter. The parlor smelled of pipe tobacco and old regrets. Knoll sat in a high-backed chair, cane across his knees, eyes still sharp as a factor's scale. He listened without interruption. When Arthur mentioned the $1 transfer, Knoll's mouth tightened. Voclair was drowning, he said at last. War took the markets. Debts took the rest. Dufresne held notes he couldn't pay. They wanted blood or its equivalent. A long pause. Pipe smoke curled toward the ceiling like a question. He never left Louisiana, Knoll continued. Not north. Not anywhere. Body turned up in a drainage canal outside Plaquemine, May 1865. Single knife wound, clean. Coroner called it accident. Fall. I knew Henri. He didn't fall. Arthur leaned forward. Then? Knoll met his gaze. Someone sealed 3 people in a wall. Someone knew. And someone decided Henri Voclair shouldn't breathe another sunrise to brag about it. The words landed like stones in deep water. Back at Voclair Plantation, the house felt smaller. The walls closer. The portrait in the parlor watched with painted satisfaction. Arthur placed the tin box on the study desk, the same desk that had once tallied lives like bales of cotton. Lantern light trembled. Edgar stood rigid. Thomas Greer filled the doorway, silent as stone. The wax seal was black with age, brittle. Arthur's knife slipped under it. A soft crackle. The lid popped free. Stale air air that had waited since April 1865. Inside, one folded letter on yellowed paper. Ink faded but legible. Elegant hand. Not the scrawl of an unlettered man. Someone had taught Tusan to write. Someone had given him paper. Someone had let him keep hope long enough to record its murder. Arthur unfolded it with hands that shook. No salutation. No signature. Just truth poured onto the page. Tusan wrote of March 1865. Confederacy collapsing. Freedom a rumor that grew louder each day. Voclair frantic. Creditors closing. Word came, Dufresne would collect debt in flesh, Tusan, Adele, Felix to be shipped south to Terrebonne Parish sugar fields. Deeper bondage. Farther from Union lines. Tusan refused. He knew the house. He had built its secrets. A small disused storage room off the service corridor. He provisioned it water, cornbread, a blanket. A hiding place. A few days, perhaps a week. Until the bluecoats came. We went in willingly, the letter read. We thought it refuge. We heard distant guns. Rumors of Lee's surrender. Freedom was close. We prayed. Adele sang psalms to Felix. I told them stories of the river when it ran free. April 9, 1865. The day Lee surrendered at Appomattox. Tusan wrote the date carefully. He could not have known its meaning. Sealed in darkness, he still marked time. Then the tone changed. Script hurried. Ink darker. Sounds outside. Not cannons. Mortar. Brick. Tapping. We shouted. Beat the wall. They kept building. From the outside. Someone sealed us in. The final lines trembled across the page. Master Voclair would rather we rot here than walk free. Rather we be nothing than belong to another or to ourselves. Adele prays. Felix weeps. I write until the candle fails. If anyone finds this. The sentence ended in a smear. As though the pen dropped. As though breath failed. Arthur could not speak. Edgar wept openly. Greer stared at the wall as though seeing through it to 1865. The letter was not evidence. It was testimony. A voice from inside the grave. Dignified. Precise. Heartbroken. Tusan had not been murdered in rage. He had been executed by calculation. Voclair's final spite, if I cannot own you, no one will. Arthur returned to Levi Dubose one last time. The old man sat outside his cabin, cane between knees, eyes on the cane fields that had once been his prison. Arthur laid the letter before him. Levi read slowly. Lips moved. Eyes closed. When he opened them again, tears tracked the deep lines of his face. There was another, he said. Do sit. Brought from Baton Rouge. Rough hand. Bricklayer. No kin here. No name that mattered. Appeared in March. Worked day and night on that wall. Then vanished. Voclair said he finished and left. Levi's voice dropped. 2 nights before it was done, I hid in the stable. Heard them argue. Voclair shouting. Do sit silent. Then Voclair said clear as day, they stay in there until I say otherwise. I told myself it was horses. Supplies. Anything but the truth. Because the truth was too heavy to carry. Arthur asked the question that had haunted him. Why never speak? Levi looked at him with ancient patience. Who would listen, Mr. Devo? In 1865? 1875? Last year? We were property. A dead planter's word weighed more than a living field hand's. Who believes the dead can accuse the dead? The silence stretched. Crickets sang in the cane. Somewhere far off, an owl called once a low, mournful note. Arthur understood then. The wall was not only brick. It was silence. Indifference. A system that let a man break his own people alive rather than see them free. And it had stood for 22 years because no one dared tear it down. Until now. Arthur returned to the study. Moonlight slanted through broken shutters. He spread every piece before him, the $1 transfer, Prevost's forensic report, Nora's notarized record, Noel's testimony, Levi's confession, Tusan's letter. He began to write. Not an assessment. An indictment. Names. Dates. Motive. Method. The cold logic of a man who preferred murder to manumission. When he finished, dawn was breaking over the sugarcane. Light touched the page like absolution. Henri Voclair had chosen death for 3 souls rather than freedom. But death had not silenced them. Their voices had waited. And now, through a wall broken open, through a letter unsealed, through one man who refused to look away, they spoke. The reckoning was no longer coming. It had arrived. Arthur Devo sealed the final report on a gray November morning in 1887. The dossier was heavy, pages thick with transcription, forensic notes, notarial copies, witness statements, and Tusan's letter copied word for word in Edgar's careful hand. It was no longer an assessment of land and timber. It was testimony. A moral indictment disguised as legal paperwork. He delivered it to Beaulieu and Associates in New Orleans. The senior partner accepted the packet with polite thanks and the faintest tightening around the eyes. They filed it. Acknowledged receipt. Then silence. No grand jury. No inquest. No warrant for a long-dead man already ruled accidental death by a coroner who preferred convenience to conscience. In 1887 Louisiana, the victims were formerly enslaved. The perpetrator was white, wealthy, once, and conveniently murdered himself. The law had no mechanism because it had never been built for such a reckoning. Property could not murder property. And dead property left no plaintiff. Arthur stood on the levee watching the Mississippi slide past like indifferent time. He had expected justice to wear robes and carry a gavel. Instead it wore indifference and carried nothing at all. The disillusionment settled in his bones like river damp, cold, permanent. But silence breeds its own resistance. Nora Fontenot never asked permission. She worked alone in the schoolhouse after the last child left, oil lamp burning low. Night after night she copied every scrap, the $1 transfer, Remy's marginal notes that hinted at shame he could never voice aloud, debt ledgers that traced Voclair's ruin straight to desperation. She wrote her own cover letter, short, unadorned, burning. She mailed the packet to Claude Arsenault at the New Orleans Daily Picayune. Arsenault was known for printing what others buried. He did not disappoint. On December 3, 1887, the story appeared not on page 1, where cotton prices and yellow fever quarantines fought for ink, but on page 7, beneath an advertisement for cast iron skillets. Small type. No illustration. Yet the words were unmistakable. Henri Voclair, planter turned murderer. Tusan, Adele, Felix, named in newsprint for the first time. The sealed room. The $1 transaction. The letter from the grave. A single clean knife wound that ended Voclair before he could boast. The city barely stirred. A few letters to the editor arrived, most venomous, defending a man pushed to extremes by war. One stood apart. Handwritten. Unsigned. From a freedman's daughter in New Orleans. We have always known. Now at last someone wrote it down. Arthur clipped it. Folded it inside his journal beside a pressed flower from the burial ground. Proof that truth, however small, finds ears. Nora did not stop at newspapers. She went to the parish clerk's office. 3 times. Each visit polite. Each visit steel-wrapped. She demanded death certificates for Tusan, Adele, Felix. Official entry in the register. Recognition in black ink on official paper. Mr. Devo resisted. No formal inquest. No surviving kin. Time has passed. Old stories. On the 3rd visit Arthur stood beside her, silent, immaculate in his assessor's suit, the weight of Beaulieu and Associates behind him like an unspoken threat. Devo sighed. Opened the ledger. November 14, 1887. 3 names entered. He insisted on one final indignity, surname Voclair. Custom, he said. Those who lived on the place take the planter's name. Nora's jaw tightened. She protested. Arthur's hand rested lightly on the counter, enough pressure to remind the clerk who stood there. The compromise held. Tusan Voclair. Adele Voclair. Felix Voclair. Cause, sealed enclosure, 1865. Cold. Clinical. But present. In the record. The smallest, hardest victory. November air carried a bite when the procession moved through Plaquemines. Churchyard. 3 plain pine coffins. No brass. No flowers beyond what Levi had gathered from the roadside, wild asters, fragile and defiant. St. Philip's Parish churchyard was divided by a low stone wall. Polished marble and wrought iron on one side. Simple wooden crosses and bare mounds on the other. The free black burying ground. They laid the coffins in the second section. No fanfare. No choir. Only the priest Père Alphonse Severin, young, Creole, eyes steady, speaking the ancient rites with the same solemnity he would give any soul. Levi Dubose stood closest. Cane planted in the earth like a stake. His voice carried across the quiet plot. Tusan. My brother in labor and in blood. Stonemason. Builder of walls that should have sheltered, not imprisoned. Adele. His wife. Healer with gentle hands and fierce heart. Felix. Their son. Boy who asked questions the world was not ready to answer. He stopped. No more words were needed. The names hung in the air, spoken aloud by someone who had known their faces, their laughter, their fear. Arthur stood at the iron fence line, hat over heart. Edgar sketched the scene in his journal, quick lines capturing Levi's bowed head, the priest's raised hand, the turned earth. When the last psalm faded, the ground received them. The silence afterward was different. Not oppressive. Not empty. Sorrowful, yes, but peaceful. A long overdue return. The house did not survive the century. By 1891 the Voclair mansion was rubble. Columns toppled like felled kings. The sealed corridor where Greer's pickaxe first bit deep, crushed under wrecking bars. Cypress giants felled. Roots ripped free. Within a decade the land was flat, green, anonymous cane stretching to the horizon. No marker. No scar. Only sugarcane whispering over what had been done. Arthur returned to New Orleans. He assessed land again. Measured boundaries. Calculated value. But every property now carried an invisible weight. He saw ledgers differently. Saw names differently. He spoke. Little of Iberville Parish. The memories were too private, too heavy to share casually. Edgar Tate kept the journals. Locked in a trunk. Sacred. He became a land attorney in Baton Rouge, competent, respected. But the pages from 1887 remained untouched. Until 1901. 15 years after the wall opened. He found the trunk while moving offices. Dust. Old paper scent. He opened the journals. Read his own younger handwriting. Relived every moment, the skull that never appeared, only the hand, the bones, the letter, Levi's quiet testimony, Nora's unyielding resolve, the burial under November sky. Between two pages, the small embroidered cloth from the tin box. Faded vine. 3 tiny flowers. A mother's handiwork. A family's last trace. That night Edgar wrote one final entry. 2 hours. Pen moving steadily. He poured it all out again, the discovery, the indifference, the small victories, the enduring silence. He ended with these words. The house is gone. The fields have covered it. The world moved on. But I remember their names. Tusan. Adele. Felix. They were real. They suffered. They tried to leave proof they had lived. And someone years later still listens. If anyone ever reads this, remember them. Not as shadows in a wall, but as people who deserved better than the silence that swallowed them. He closed the journal. Locked the trunk. Outside, the Baton Rouge night was quiet. Somewhere a river moved on. But in those pages, 3 names refused to stay buried. And that refusal, small, stubborn, enduring, was perhaps the closest thing to justice the world would give them. What secrets do you think still sleep beneath those cane fields? Do walls ever truly forget what they've held? Leave your thoughts below. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you that history is carried in whispers as much as in headlines, share it. Subscribe. Ring the bell. Some truths wait decades to be heard. But once spoken, they never go silent again.